Close your eyes for just a moment and go back with me to 1960. The lights in Las Vegas burned like a second sun. The Sands Hotel was the center of the universe, and if you were lucky enough to be sitting in that showroom on any given night, you were watching something the world would never see again. Two men. One in a tuxedo so sharp it looked like it was tailored by God himself, the other with a smile so wide and warm it could fill any room on earth. Standing side by side on that stage, making every single person in that audience feel like the luckiest soul alive. Now, I want to tell you something. I have spent a long time sitting with the real story of Frank Sinatra and Sammy Davis Jr. Not the version the newspapers printed, not the glossy Hollywood portrait, but the truth that lived underneath all of it. And what I found has stayed with me, because what Frank said about Sammy, what he finally confirmed, near the very end of his life, it changes the way you see both of them. By the time we reach the end of this story together, I promise you, you will look at that famous friendship with completely new eyes. Now, I want to take you forward for just a moment, to 1990. Sammy Davis Jr. is gone. He passed away in May of that year, taken by throat cancer at the age of 64. And Frank Sinatra, this man who had stood beside Sammy for decades, who had fought for him when no one else would, who had called him his brother in everything but blood. Frank was devastated in a way that very few people were allowed to see. Those who were close to him in those final years say that he would sometimes go quiet at dinner, mid-conversation, staring at nothing. And when someone asked what he was thinking about, Frank said simply, Sammy. But here is what almost no one knows. In private, Frank confirmed something about Sammy that the public had long suspected but never fully understood. Something about what Sammy had truly carried, what he had truly sacrificed, and what Frank had never said loudly enough while Sammy was still alive. But to understand why that happened, we need to go back to the beginning. Sammy Davis Jr. was, by any honest measure, one of the most gifted performers who ever lived. I want you to really sit with that. Not gifted in the way we casually throw that word around today, truly almost impossibly gifted. He could sing with the soul of a man twice his age. He could tap dance at speeds that defied what a human body should be able to do. He could do impressions so precise that people who had worked with those very celebrities said it was uncanny. He acted. He played instruments. He performed with a joy that was so complete, so total, that audiences didn't just watch Sammy. They felt lifted by him. B-roll note: archive performance footage of Sammy Davis Jr. on stage at the Sands Hotel, Las Vegas, early 1960s. Show his footwork during a tap number, and a wide shot of the audience's reaction. Faces lit up, leaning forward. By the late 1950s, Sammy was a star of the very first order. He had survived an automobile accident in 1954 that cost him his left eye, an accident that would have ended most careers before they truly began. Instead, Sammy came back wearing an eye patch and performing with even more fire than before. He was on Broadway. He was recording albums that sold by the hundreds of thousands. And he was part of the most famous social circle in the world, the Rat Pack, that legendary group of performers who gathered around Frank Sinatra like planets around the sun. Frank. Even saying the name, you know exactly who I mean. By 1960, Francis Albert Sinatra was not merely a famous man. He was an institution. He was the voice of a generation. A voice that could break your heart with a ballad at midnight and then have you laughing and snapping your fingers at a swinging number 2 songs later. When Frank walked into the Sands, the room changed, the air changed, and standing beside him, night after night, was Sammy. Smaller in stature, boundless in talent, and carrying something much heavier than anyone in that sparkling showroom could see. Here is what the public never fully understood about Sammy Davis Jr., and what Frank, in private, to those closest to him, would eventually confirm with great sorrow. Sammy was performing in a country that did not fully accept him. This was not a quiet, abstract tension. It was daily. It was constant. It showed up in ways that were sometimes visible and sometimes hidden, but it was always there. When the Rat Pack performed at the Sands in Las Vegas in the early 1960s, Frank had negotiated hard to make sure that Sammy, and fellow performer Joey Bishop and others, could stay at the hotel, eat in the restaurant, and walk through the front door like any white performer. Frank reportedly told the management of the Sands directly, "If Sammy cannot stay here, none of us stay here." That was not a small thing. That was Frank using every ounce of his considerable power on behalf of his friend. B-roll note. Still photographs of the Rat Pack together at the Sands. Frank, Sammy, Dean Martin, Peter Lawford, and Joey Bishop. Then archival photos of Las Vegas Strip signage from the late 1950s and early 1960s. But there were forces Frank could not control. There were venues he could not change. There were moments, and people who witnessed them described these with great pain, where Sammy would perform to a standing ovation and then be reminded, in ways both blunt and subtle, that the world outside that spotlight had not caught up with the love inside the room. Dean Martin, for his part, was fond of Sammy but had a comedian's habit of making jokes at Sammy's expense. Jokes that sometimes stung, even when delivered with a laugh. Sammy rarely spoke publicly about the hurt. He smiled. He performed. He gave everything he had every single night. And Frank saw it. Frank watched all of it. And according to those who knew him best, it weighed on him far more than he ever let on. In 1960, Sammy Davis Jr. did something that stunned Hollywood and the wider public in equal measure. He announced that he was going to marry May Britt, a Swedish actress, a white woman. This was not a quiet private matter. Interracial marriage was still illegal in many states in America. The public reaction was swift, loud, and in many corners, deeply cruel. Sammy received threats. He received hate mail by the sackful. There were people, powerful people, including figures connected to the incoming Kennedy administration, who quietly suggested that Sammy keep a lower profile during the presidential transition, because his relationship was considered a political liability. Think about that. A man at the absolute peak of his talent and fame, being asked to make himself smaller so that other people would be more comfortable. Frank Sinatra stood by Sammy. He attended the wedding on November 13, 1960, in Hollywood. He was there. But in the years that followed, and this is where the private truth begins to diverge from the public story, those close to Frank say that he carried genuine guilt about what Sammy had endured. Not because Frank had done anything wrong, but because Frank understood deeply that there were moments where he could have spoken louder, could have pushed harder, could have used his extraordinary influence more forcefully. And in just a moment, I am going to share with you the one detail from Frank's final years that changes everything about how we read that friendship. Because what Frank eventually said, quietly, privately, in the way that men of that generation sometimes only spoke the deepest truths when the time for performance had passed, was this: that Sammy Davis Jr. had given more to American entertainment and asked for less in return than any man Frank had ever known. And that the world had taken from Sammy in ways it never fully acknowledged and never fully repaid. Frank said that Sammy smiled because Sammy was built to give joy. But Frank knew, because he had seen it up close for 40 years, that behind that smile was a man who had paid a price that most people never saw and never counted. What the cameras rarely captured was the Sammy that his family and his closest friends knew. His daughter, Tracy Davis, has spoken over the years about a father who was deeply loving, endlessly generous, and privately far more tender than the performing dynamo the world saw on stage. She has described a man who collected art with quiet passion, who read voraciously, who could sit at the piano for hours not to perform but simply because music was where he felt most at peace. B-roll note. Candid photographs of Sammy Davis Jr. off stage, at home with his children in informal settings. If available, footage from television interviews where Sammy speaks quietly and personally rather than performing. Those who worked alongside Sammy in the later years of his career spoke consistently about his generosity toward younger performers. He would stay after rehearsals to give notes. He would recommend people for jobs. He would show up for other people's openings and stand and cheer. Comedian and actor Billy Crystal, who became close to Sammy in the 1980s and was devastated by his death, described him as a man of almost overwhelming warmth, someone who made you feel in his presence that you were the most important person in the room. And Frank, who was not always the most emotionally expressive man in private life, those who knew him described a certain Sicilian reserve that sat beneath the showmanship. Frank reportedly told people in his inner circle more than once that Sammy was the most complete performer he had ever seen. Not the best singer, not the best dancer, the most complete. A man who could do everything, and who did all of it with love. That is not a small thing coming from Frank Sinatra. The 1970s were not easy years for Sammy. The cultural landscape had shifted beneath him. The era that had made him a superstar, the era of supper clubs and showrooms, of tuxedos and cigarette smoke and the particular glamour of the Rat Pack years, that era had given way to rock music, to a younger generation that had its own heroes and its own sounds. Sammy adapted as best he could. He had a brief, surprising television comeback. He recorded new music. He toured relentlessly, because the stage was where he felt most fully himself. His health, however, was beginning to tell a different story. Decades of performing, late nights, constant travel, the physical demands of a performance style that had always asked everything of his body, had taken their toll. And there was the smoking. Hip replacement surgery in 1985 slowed him considerably. Those who saw him backstage in his final years described a man who was in more pain than he let on, but who walked out in front of an audience and became, miraculously, the Sammy the audience remembered. Frank watched all of this from close range, and according to those in their shared circle, Frank's feelings were complicated by something he could not fix. He could pick up the phone. He could arrange work. He could show up. But he could not undo the weight that Sammy had carried. He could not retroactively make the world more fair. And by the time Sammy was diagnosed with throat cancer in early 1990, Frank was facing something he had very little practice with: the impending loss of a man he considered irreplaceable. Sammy Davis Jr. died on May 16, 1990. He was 64 years old. Frank Sinatra outlived him by 8 years, dying in May of 1998 at the age of 82. Here is what I want to leave you with. Frank Sinatra was a complicated man. Brilliant and flawed, generous and difficult, capable of great loyalty and capable of great stubbornness. He would not want us to make him into a saint. But what Frank confirmed, in those quiet conversations near the end of his life, was something that the people who loved both of these men had always sensed: that Sammy Davis Jr. was extraordinary not just in talent, but in character. That what Sammy gave to this world, the joy, the energy, the sheer, defiant brilliance of his performances, came at a cost that he bore with a grace that was almost unbearable to witness if you knew the full story. Frank knew the full story. And Frank, in his way, imperfect, late, in the private language of men who did not often speak this way, said so. The contradiction at the heart of Sammy's life is this: he was loved by millions, celebrated everywhere he went, and yet he lived and worked in a world that did not always love him back in the way he deserved. He gave it joy anyway, every single night. That, I think, is worth remembering. That is worth honoring. And that is why, all these years later, when you hear that voice or see those feet moving, something inside you recognizes it real and human and true. Now I want to ask you something, and I genuinely hope you will share your answer down in the comments below. Do you remember the first time you saw Sammy Davis Jr. perform? Whether it was in a movie theater, on your television set, or perhaps even in person. Tell me where you were and what it felt like. Those memories matter. They are worth keeping. And if this story moved you the way it moved me, I hope you will consider subscribing to this channel. This is a place for people who remember when stars were truly larger than life, and who know that the stories behind the glamour are always the ones worth telling.